Odysseus, the celebrated son of Ithaca, whose renown spread throughout Greece, was born on the slopes of Mount Nereus, a gift of the gods to the small island. A subtle rain marked his birth, and his mother, inspired by this omen, gave him the name Odysseus. Laertes and Anticlea felt blessed with his birth. The wise centaur Chiron trained this young man, destined for greatness. Chiron, born of Cronus and the nymph Phillida, took refuge on Mount Pelion and possessed a wisdom that attracted heroes from far and wide. His ability to teach the arts, music, hunting, and above all, medicine, was legendary. Odysseus, avid for knowledge, stood out among all his pupils, absorbing his teachings like a sponge to water. On an excursion with his grandfather Autolycus, Odysseus confronted a wild boar on Mount Parnassus. Despite his prowess, he received a scar that he would carry throughout his life. The young prince of Ithaca traveled through Greece, becoming more and more known and respected. On one of his travels, he met Iphitus in Laconia, who, in an act of generosity, gave him a bow that had belonged to his father, King Euripus, a gift from Apollo himself. Grateful, Odysseus gave him a sword and a spear in return. The adventures continued when he returned to Ithaca. Autolycus, Odysseus' cunning grandfather, had unconventionally acquired mares. Blessed with the cunning of Hermes, Autolycus transformed the mares so that they were unrecognizable. On another journey, Odysseus arrived at Taphos, where Enchiale, grateful for his visit, presented him with a deadly poison for his arrows. With skill and practice, Odysseus mastered the use of bow and arrows, becoming a warrior second to none. As he grew older, Odysseus demonstrated a deep devotion to the divine laws, constantly seeking guidance from Zeus and Athena. His heart, filled with nobility and respect, led him to become the hero that everyone in Greece came to admire. As time passed, Odysseus matured and prepared to become king. His father Laertes gave him the kingdom he had built with wealth and power. Following his father's teachings, Odysseus began his rule in Ithaca. His mental agility and cunning made him very popular among his people, as he succeeded in expanding and enriching his kingdom. Now, he had to choose his wife and future queen. Although he was attracted to Helen, a beautiful young daughter of Zeus and desired by many, she chose Menelaus as her consort and future king of Sparta. This implied that if anyone offended Helen, all her former suitors, including Odysseus, were to defend her. Odysseus, unable to conquer Helen, traveled to Sparta, where King Icarus had a daughter, Penelope, about to be married. Icarus proposed a race, with the promise that the winner would marry his daughter. Although Icarus was a formidable racer, Odysseus managed to win, gaining the right to marry Penelope. Although Icarus proposed that they stay in Sparta, Odysseus chose to return to Ithaca with his new wife, who was warmly welcomed by the people. From their marriage, a son, Telemachus, was born, and together, the family enjoyed peaceful times. However, the peace was interrupted when messengers arrived reporting that Helen had been kidnapped. All the former suitors, including Odysseus, were to search for her. Upon learning of the situation, Odysseus tried to feign insanity to avoid participating but was discovered. Helen had been taken by Paris, a Trojan prince who had fallen in love with her during a trip to Greece. Paris believed it was his divine destiny to be with Helen. This event triggered the famous Trojan War, in which Odysseus had to fight for years. In great anger, Menelaus formed a vast team to invade Troy and recover Helen. On this team were heroes such as Odysseus, Achilles, and Agamemnon. After a decade of conflict, the Greeks finally prevailed. After this decade-long war, Odysseus, anxious to return home, decided to travel a stretch with Agamemnon's men to his beloved Ithaca. Unfortunately, a fierce storm scattered Odysseus and Agamemnon's ships. When the sea calmed, Odysseus and his crew arrived in Thrace. The locals saw them as enemies, which led to a conflict that wiped out almost everyone on the island except a priest of Apollo. This priest offered Odysseus 12 amphorae of an extremely potent wine, which had to be mixed with water before drinking. Odysseus, in gratitude, forgave the priest Marin. After sacking the city, Odysseus led his men back to sea, braving icy winds. On their voyage, they found an unknown island. Odysseus sent 3 of his men to explore, but they did not return. Concerned, he sent more men, who found the first 3 in an altered state due to a mysterious fruit, the lotus, which they had consumed. This fruit had erased all their memories. They were taken back to the boat, where they only wished to continue eating the lotus. Odysseus, waiting for them to recover, decided to leave the island. Then they arrived in Sicily. While exploring, they found a cave full of food. While they were enjoying the feast, a giant Cyclops named Polyphemus entered and blocked the exit with a large rock. Odysseus tried to negotiate his freedom by invoking Zeus, but Polyphemus defiantly claimed not to fear him. Ignoring pleas, Polyphemus devoured 2 of Odysseus' men, leaving the rest terrified. During the darkness of the night, Polyphemus ate 2 men at dawn and left with his cattle for the field. Odysseus and his crew sought a means to escape the fearsome Cyclops and avoid being his next meal. Working together, they picked up a large olive branch, about 100 feet long, that belonged to the Cyclops' firewood. Odysseus sharpened it with his sword, planning to use it against the Cyclops to gain his freedom. At sunset, Polyphemus returned, and after eating 2 other men for dinner, Odysseus approached with a cup of wine as a gift. Upon tasting it, the Cyclops was amazed. When Polyphemus asks Odysseus his name, he responds by saying that his name is Nobody. The Cyclops, excited by the wine, drank until he fell fast asleep. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the men heated the tip of the branch and plunged it into the Cyclops' eye, causing him immense pain. Hearing Polyphemus' cries, other Cyclops came to help. But when they asked what had happened, Polyphemus shouted, "No one attacked me!" Confused, the Cyclops decided that, if no one had hurt him, they could do nothing and left. The next morning, Polyphemus, still blind, decided to let his animals out of the cave. Anticipating this, Odysseus devised a plan. He ordered his men to tie themselves under the sheep so that they could leave undetected by the Cyclops. The plan worked and all the men, still shaken by recent events, managed to escape and sailed back to Ithaca. Upon reaching their next destination, Odysseus and his crew were warmly welcomed by Aeolus in his abode. Aeolus controlled the winds and, upon learning that Odysseus was looking for the way home, he gave him an exceptional gift, a leather bag containing all the winds of the world. Aeolus advised Odysseus to take care of it, for only a gentle breeze would guide them to Ithaca, their home. With the promise of a safe return, Odysseus and his men resumed their journey to Ithaca. As the days passed, they seemed to be on the right track, and the weary Odysseus, hoping to see his family again, fell into a deep sleep. But while he slept, some of the crew suspected that the bag hid riches that Odysseus did not want to share. In their curiosity, they opened the bag, releasing the wild winds that swept them back into Aeolus' domain. This time, however, an indignant Aeolus drove them from his land. Adrift again, they came to an island inhabited by cannibal giants who attacked their ships with giant boulders. Only with cunning and skill did Odysseus and his ship manage to escape, while others were not so lucky. Later, they arrived at an island ruled by the sorceress Circe. The animals that greeted them seemed friendly, but there was something strange in the air. Odysseus sent a party to explore and get supplies, but when they were slow to return, one of the men discovered that Circe had transformed his companions into pigs. With the help of the god Hermes, who granted him a protective brew, Odysseus confronted Circe. Realizing that she was in front of the famous hero, and feeling captivated by him, Circe freed the men and transformed them back into humans. Odysseus and his crew remained there for a while, resting and regaining strength, although the longing to return home to their loved ones, especially his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, never disappeared. The magician Circe, with a heavy heart, allows Odysseus to leave his homeland to join his crew. Amid his despair, she suggests that he visit the underworld to ask the seer Tiresias about the success of his journey. During that descent, Odysseus encounters souls from the past, including his mother, with whom he manages to communicate and say a sad farewell. Tiresias warns him of the trials that still await him on his journey, but also assures him that he will eventually return to Ithaca and be reunited with his family. With hope firm, Odysseus returns to Circe to say goodbye, receiving valuable advice for his perilous return. On his journey, he faces the threat of the sirens. To resist their enchanting song, he makes his crew cover their ears and, by his desire, is tied to the ship's mast. Although he tries to free himself to follow the seductive melody, his men hold him firmly until they are safe. The voyage continues with the threat of giant rocks and the appearance of Scylla, a terrifying-looking monster, and Charybdis, whose whirling whirlpools consume everything in their path. Despite losing several of their men, they make it through and the ship continues on its course. Time marches on, and with supplies running low, they reach an island full of sacred cows belonging to the god Helios. Despite Odysseus' instructions not to harm these animals, hunger overcomes his crew and they consume some of them. This action triggers the wrath of Helios, who turns to Zeus for revenge. In response, Zeus sends a thunderbolt that destroys the ship, leaving Odysseus alone in the vast ocean. After struggling against the current for days, he reaches the island of the nymph Calypso, who falls in love with him. Despite Calypso's temptations and offers, including the promise of immortality, Odysseus' desire to return to Ithaca remains strong. Finally, Hermes intervenes on Zeus' orders, urging Calypso to free Odysseus. With provisions from the nymph, he begins another attempt to return, but a storm wrecks his ship once again. Once again, Odysseus, now without strength, wakes up on the shores of the island of Escharia, where he is found by several women who approached him when they saw a completely naked man. Nausicaa, princess of the kingdom of the Peisios, decides to help the unfortunate man by going to the palace with her father, King Alcino. The king of the Peisios offers all his hospitality to Odysseus, giving him his full help. Undoubtedly, Odysseus did not go unnoticed by Princess Nausicaa, and she fell in love with the noble hero. Alcino, aware of this, decides to offer the hand of his beloved daughter to Odysseus, and Odysseus refuses. Odysseus explains to the king that he should return to Ithaca and that his family was waiting for him because he had a wife named Penelope and a son, with the uncertainty of knowing where his beloved Odysseus would be. Alcino, very generous, understands Odysseus and decides to help him since his island was very close to Ithaca, and orders to send a fleet to Ithaca to return Odysseus to his homeland. They set sail, and Odysseus felt very calm because he was already very close to his home. When he leaned out of the bow, his eyes were filled with brightness when he saw the shores of Ithaca. He had finally reached his homeland. At last, he rested, sleeping deeply because he was close to the shore. The sailors took him down and left him asleep on the island. When Odysseus woke up very excited, he thanked the gods and a flash of light appeared in front of him. It was the goddess Athena who advised him to visit Eumaeus, a servant of the palace, a man who would help him in his return to the throne. Eumaeus tells Odysseus that during the years he was away, several suitors joined him to marry his wife and that he had to fight for her. In total, 108 suitors were willing to leave everything for Penelope. They had put so much pressure on the queen that they all took over the palace, enjoying all the riches of the kingdom until Penelope decided on one. Quickly, Odysseus asks about his beloved son Telemachus, and Eumaeus tells him that his son did not agree with the men who pretended to be his mother, and that he had had enough of them. The night passes, and in the morning, Odysseus decides to enter the palace disguised as a homeless man, so that no one recognizes him, especially not his wife's suitors. He was reunited with his son Telemachus, and that night he planned his revenge to defeat the men who were waiting for the throne. Penelope, surprised by the arrival of a stranger to the village, decides to talk to him and ask if he has heard anything about Odysseus. The disheveled stranger speaks to Penelope, swearing that her husband will be home very soon. Telemachus tells his mother to choose one of the suitors, putting us to the test. Finally, Penelope informs the suitors that they have to pass a test to choose the new husband and king of Ithaca. The test was that they had to use Odysseus' bow and demonstrate their aim. The one who managed to do it would be the new husband of Penelope. With no luck, none of the men managed to do so, nor could they even draw the string of the powerful bow. Finally, Odysseus takes the bow, tightens the hard string, and manages to launch the powerful arrows, demonstrating his aim. Following his plan, he kills with his arrows Penelope's unfortunate suitors with the help of his son Telemachus. Odysseus approaches Penelope, but she does not recognize him because it has been 20 years since the last time she saw him. However, very astute, the Greek hero describes several things about his life to his wife. In addition, he shows her the terrible scar he had on his knee because of a wild boar, and she finally recognizes him full of happiness. At last her beloved had returned after 20 years away from his home, far from his people and far from the one who loved him deeply. He regained his throne and at last, he could be at peace. Some accounts claim that Odysseus continued his adventures even in his old age. On one of these journeys, he arrived in the territory of the Despotos. There he met a stunning woman named Callidice and decided to stay by her side until she died. After this loss, Odysseus returned to Ithaca to be reunited with his first wife, Penelope. It is also told that Odysseus welcomed into his kingdom his son Telegonus, the fruit of his relationship with the goddess Circe. However, a tragic turn of events led Telegonus to inadvertently kill his father. Grief-stricken and full of remorse, Telegonus carried Odysseus' body to Penelope's house, where he was honored with a moving ceremony. Despite this tragedy, Odysseus is said to have ruled his beloved kingdom for many years and eventually spent his last days in Ithaca, surrounded by his loved ones and far from the ocean. In time, Telegonus developed feelings for Penelope and married her. Surprisingly, Circe, his mother, accompanied them to Ithaca and, soon after, Telemachus, son of Odysseus and Penelope, was attracted to Circe and took her as his wife. The life of the intrepid Greek hero, Odysseus, thus ends, but his epic adventures and his longed-for return home left an indelible mark on the history of Greece and the world.